Hi guys, welcome to the channel. So, why the definitions of trauma are all wrong. So in this video I'm going to talk about the definition of trauma and why it's critical to have a very solid definition so that we can better understand trauma and most importantly, how to heal from it. Okay? So just to back up for a second, when I decided to start a trauma-based YouTube channel, I realized that I didn't have a good definition of trauma and I didn't really understand exactly what it was. Although I have experienced trauma and I have learned to overcome trauma, so I have a good experiential knowledge and understanding of it, but I didn't have a solid definition. So I thought that would be a good place to start from. So I did a quick internet search, but the results I got were very disappointing. All right, they were either too vague, too general, incomplete, conflicting, or just downright wrong. Okay, so not a good start. In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the definitions that I found, and I'll talk about the ones I don't like and the ones that I do like, and the reasons for each. And then I'll also attempt my own definition of trauma, and I'll talk about what trauma means on this particular channel, which will inform how we address trauma right here. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. All right, so I found, this was the first definition I found, which is from the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, 5th edition. Okay, so trauma. It's a noun, by the way. Okay, and it means, first definition is serious injury to the body as from physical violence or an accident. Okay, right, you can't really argue with that. That is a definition of trauma in a particular sense of that word, for, strictly speaking, a physical injury. For example, if you go to the ER with a massive head injury, so I stuck on that word ER because we call it A&E over here in Ireland, accident and emergency, but if you want to call it the ER, emergency room, so if you go there with a massive head injury from like a baseball bat, the doctor will say, this man has head trauma, and he would be correct, but still this is not the meaning of the word that we are looking for. Okay, second definition. So trauma is severe emotional or mental distress caused by an experience. Now I didn't like this definition, and I'll tell you why. So if you experience something, and it's if you experience something, you may have an emotional or mental distress, like they say, but that reaction may be completely appropriate for that situation. Okay, I'm not going to go into examples of that, but this does not explain trauma. Okay, also this suggests that trauma is temporary, so it implies that when that experience ends, then the emotional and mental distress that you feel disappears. So it leaves out the lasting effect of the experience, which I think is very important in terms of in terms of defining what trauma is. Moving on, so the next definition from the same source: trauma is an experience that causes severe anxiety or emotional distress, such as a R word, rhymes with grape, or combat. So an experience that causes severe anxiety or emotional distress. Okay, now this is clearly incorrect, as it defines trauma as simply an experience. So the experience itself is not trauma. That experience may be traumatic, but it's not trauma itself. There is no such thing, and also there's no such thing as an objective experience, because we all experience differently. So again, I don't like that definition. So I found another one on mind.org.uk website. What is trauma? And this is their definition: going through very stressful, frightening, or distressing events is sometimes called trauma. Is it? Nope. That's called experiencing. Going through an event is experiencing that event. Okay? So, terrible definition. And it goes on to say, when we talk about emotional or psychological trauma, we might mean situations or events we find traumatic. So you're talking about a situation or event. That's not trauma. Plus you're using the event traumatic to try to explain trauma. So a poor definition. But mainly it's wrong because you're calling trauma the situation or the event. We might also mean how we're affected by our experiences. This is slightly better, but how are we affected? It's too vague in terms of how we might be affected by an experience. Also, we can be positively affected by a given experience. It doesn't suggest that this is a negative event or a negative reaction or a negative effect. So is that trauma? No. No. All right. It goes on to say, traumatic events can happen at any age and can cause long-lasting harm. Okay, so this is true, but once again, it doesn't define what trauma is, but it does mention something very important in that it can cause long-lasting harm. So that is key, in my opinion, to any definition of trauma. So everyone has a different reaction to trauma. So you might notice any effects quickly or a long time afterwards. That's part of what they say. Okay. So once again, pretty poor description or definition of trauma there, although one or two things we can take from it. I found this on Merriam Webster. Full definition of trauma. 1. An injury such as a wound to living tissue caused by an extrinsic agent. And once again, that's like the first one we read out, and nothing wrong with that definition, but it's not the definition we're looking for. It's not the sense of the word we're looking for. B, a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional distress or physical injury. Aha, okay, I quite like this one. Disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury. This may be the best one we have yet. Okay, I'm gonna list that in the description below. Okay, so it's a pretty good definition of trauma. C is an emotional upset, and that's it. Okay, so apart from the fact that this sounds extremely trivial, very minimizing, it also doesn't include the lasting effects of trauma, which we're kind of looking for. Okay. So at the Center for Treatment of Anxiety and Mood Disorders, they say, in general, I don't like how they start that out. In general, we're not looking for general, are we? Trauma can be defined as a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. Okay, and it's been described as a psychological or emotional response to an event. Nope, I don't believe trauma is a response. Once again, your response to a particular event may be appropriate or inappropriate. It may be a healthy response. Trauma is not a healthy response. Trauma is simply not a response. It's more like a condition, in my opinion. It's more like a condition. But it's certainly not a response. And once again, if you respond to an event after you respond to a particular event, then it's over. You know, the event might continue, but your response doesn't continue. It ends, it's finite, and it's gone. So it leaves out the fact that trauma can be very debilitating and prolonged, persistent and long-lasting, as we saw before. So once again, a really bad definition. When loosely applied, this trauma definition can refer to something upsetting, such as being involved in an accident. Well, they're loosely applying this, so not very strong definition. Being involved in an accident, having an illness or injury, losing a loved one, or going through a divorce. So that's all fine. They're listing events that may lead to trauma. They're listing traumatic events, which isn't extremely helpful. However, it can also encompass the far extreme and include experiences that are severely damaging, such as, once again, rhymes with grape, or torture. Okay? Yep, they're traumatic events and they can lead to trauma. But it doesn't define what trauma is. It's too general. Once again, it suggests it's temporary. Is it a one-time if it's a response, is it just a one-time response? That's not trauma. Okay. So moving on. Right. I did find another one. Okay. From Trauma Informed Care website, trauma is a pervasive problem. Okay, pervasive. It results from exposure to an incident. Exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, perhaps, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. Well, I actually quite like this one. That is quite a strong definition. Trauma is a pervasive problem. I'll read that again. It's a pervasive problem. It results from exposure to an incident or a series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. Okay, that's quite a good definition, and I will list that down below in the description. And then it goes on to list experiences that may be traumatic, including physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, childhood neglect, and so on. Okay, so although I think that definition could be stronger, it has most of the elements of what we need for a definition of trauma. Okay. So any definition, in my opinion, of trauma must account for the persistent damage to the brain and or nervous system. So not necessarily, although emotions are important, obviously an important element of trauma, but since emotions are not permanent, they can change, and once our emotions are felt, they do change. But trauma can and does affect our ability to feel and process emotions. Okay, and emotions can therefore become stuck or trapped, and we can then react emotionally to events based on those stuck or trapped emotions. So our reactions to events can then often be inappropriate to the situation. Now, I'm kind of describing symptoms of trauma and the emotional component of trauma, and it's not necessarily a definition, but it is an important part of trauma. Okay, but I think we're looking for a definition that is useful to the patient and not to the medical profession necessarily. Yeah, in my opinion, it's only the patient that can heal and overcome trauma. Now, supporting that patient in overcoming trauma is extremely important, but we need to give them the tools and support that they need in order to help them overcome trauma. And for me, a proper definition is crucial. So this is what I came up with for my definition of trauma. And by all means, guys, respond below. Tell me what you think in the comments. If this makes sense, if you agree with my definition or not, and why not. Okay, so this is how I define trauma. A change in the operation of the brain or nervous system or body-mind energetic system caused by a serious injury, violence, or a severely distressing experience. Trauma can affect our behavior and responses to later events, causing sometimes unpredictable, illogical, and irrational reactions to both benign and challenging situations. Okay? And I've gone on to lists to say this, right? So the way in which our body shares information with our brain and vice versa becomes damaged or broken by trauma. If we do not repair this brain-body function, we will likely experience mental health problems, and eventually our lives may become catastrophically impacted and impaired by the trauma. Okay, so that's my definition. It's a bit of a long-winded one, but I think it hits most of the important points of trauma and its effects. So tell me what you think. Thanks for watching. See you soon.